is an honor to be able to speak and share a little bit of my own experience with mental health at such an urgent conference. I first started realizing that I have to deal with mental illness when I was in high school. I would get these really intense anxiety attacks and didn't really know what they were until a lot later, actually. I also just had a super intense attention problem and would find it much more difficult to get through sort of menial daily tasks than a lot of the people around me could. I guess at the time when I was still in high school, the idea of sort of learning disabilities and attention problems wasn't really something that was sort of accepted as a sort of real medical condition in Lebanon. I think it still really isn't really acknowledged globally. But at the time it was, I think, more of a question of, get your stuff together, work harder. There was a lot of sort of blaming when it comes to not being able to function as efficiently as other people can. So I guess what happened was pretty typical, which is that I developed a sense of sort of inferiority and inadequacy at not being able to produce at the same level as other people. I was sort of in and out of therapy a lot from high school onwards, but would always get a lot of guilt about sort of using my parents' finances to sit with someone and talk for an hour every week or 2 hours every week, which again at the time I sort of just wrote off as being unnecessary and as something that I could sort of just deal with if I worked harder. So I stopped quite often, and then in college I had a bit of a really intense low in my first attempt at a senior year, and ended up sort of just failing a lot of my classes, picking up a couple of eating disorders, and at that point I kind of just, took my mother's advice and went back to therapy. For me as a sort of person, the way I generally deal with a lot of the questions that I have about my life and the way I work with the world around me is to get a little bit nerdy and look at papers and look at research about things like gender and sexuality and music and social issues in Lebanon, whatever it is. It tends to make me feel like a lot of these things are easier to deal with just because people are studying them. And unfortunately, when dealing with mental health, even now in 2018, there's still so little sort of academia that's published about mental health in Lebanon and in the broader region. A lot of the academia is basically about sort of the industrialized world, which really makes you think about why medically, socially, personally, this entire field, this huge part of everyone's lives is always treated as not real, right? So much so that it takes 70 years to prove that medication works. And because of all that stigma, we end up not talking about it, and we end up hiding, and we end up being ashamed of it, and then a lot of people just don't really end up getting help. Even statistically, especially for men, right, where mental health continues to be seen as some sort of weakness, which is socially unacceptable, right? So if you look at any of the research, there's always that conclusion, right, that women are significantly more likely to be afflicted with depression or generalized anxiety, but men were significantly more likely to resort to substance abuse. And those two aren't separate, right? The idea that you're not allowed to discuss these things, either because people will think it's a fiction or some sort of self-indulgence, and because of the shame that surrounds it, again, just produces this horrible, horrible situation where no one gets help. So for me, it was only when things got really, really, really bad that I allowed myself to invest financially what I would need to invest to be able to properly sort of treat or work with my mental illnesses, which can go up to $1,000 a month, sort of depending on what you have. And it's almost ridiculous to think that in a country, well, not just in Lebanon, but globally, that with illnesses that are this prevalent, that the cost of treatment continues to be this high, continues to be not covered by most insurance companies. I mean, in Lebanon, no insurance companies cover mental health, be that psychiatric or psychological. If you're dealing with mental health issues, if you feel like you need help with anything, it's important to just talk about it and get help. I mean, if you're talking to your friends, if you're talking to a therapist, if you're talking to a doctor, whatever it is, just do it. Because there shouldn't be any shame around it. And it's so common that it's ridiculous that we continue to feel anomalous about it. And if you're not dealing with mental health issues yet, I don't know, I guess end the stigma around it. Allow people to talk about it freely. Allow people to not be ashamed of that.